Recording?
Okay, there we go.
Okay. Yeah, because I didn't hear the thing at first.
Yeah, I thought
Yeah,
I
I mean,
clicked it, but
so you are currently watching the first episode of the second season of The Thinkers Oasis. Our guest today is Dr. Ryan Mullins, PhD from St. Andrews and Doctor Habilitation from Helsinki, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And he has published lots of different papers, also some books. So I think he's um, a very good person to talk about the first topic we will talk about today, which is uh, writing and publishing in, philosophy of religion or analytic philosophy more broadly speaking, because he has some papers on philosophy of time, maybe some on analytic theology, and so on. So welcome, Ryan.
hmm Thank you for having me back.
No problem. Um, were you planning on sharing a PowerPoint?
Yeah, so I'm going to take everyone through a very short presentation on how to write a paper. This
Mhm.
is something I use for my master's students at Lucerne. Um, so it'll give you some insights on how, at least how I think
Mhm.
about the issue. Okay, so yeah, let's get into this here. So what I want to do is here's just a quick glimpse of what I'm going to take you through. So the question you need to ask is, do you want to publish 60 papers and 4 books by the time you turn 40? And if so, try to follow these steps to some extent. So the 5 things I'm going to take you through on how to write a paper are: write a clear thesis statement, define your terms, know how to argue and know your audience, the importance of citations, and then how to do the research. And then afterwards, if you guys have questions, I can talk about the peer review process and that, because that's a very bizarre world. So the first thing you have to do is you have to write a very clear thesis statement, because what a good philosopher does, they try to help others understand what their position is, and then try to help others follow the argument so you can get to that position. And it's incredibly important that you have a clear thesis statement in your paper, because what your thesis statement is doing is it's giving a roadmap to the reader. What you're doing is you're giving your reader step-by-step directions of exactly where you're trying to take them. And this might seem really obvious. It might seem like it's common sense, but there is very little common sense in the world. When you're looking at academic thinkers, when you're looking at pop apologists, when you're looking at just about anybody, there's very little common sense. So it's important that you have a clear thesis statement. So let me give you an example of what a clear thesis statement looks like. And so this is from my paper called "The Problem of Arbitrary Creation for Impassibility." And so what I do in this is this in this abstract. I just say, look, there's a particular question that has plagued classical Christian theism over the centuries. What reason could God have for creating a universe? So what I've done is I've just laid out a clear question. And then I say, in this article, I shall articulate the unique claims of classical theism that other rival models of God lack. I shall argue that classical theism's unique commitments entail that God cannot create the universe for a reason. Thus, any non-classical model of God can claim to have an advantage over classical theism, because they can affirm that God creates the universe for a reason. So at this point, the reader should know what I'm going to be doing, but just to be certain, I add this other bit here, which is in section 1, I shall articulate classical theism. In section 2, and I just kind of go on and on exactly what each section is going to do. And the reason I do that is because you need people to really understand what you're up to. Here is another pro tip. So when I review papers for journals, a lot of times I end up suggesting that they get rejected because either they do not have a clear thesis statement, or the author did not follow the thesis statement that they had laid out. So let me give you an example of each. So no clear thesis statement. Someone might be like, as one ponders the effulgence of beauty, one will be reminded of the words of Lord Tifton from Yorkshire, who said, and then they just kind of throw in some untranslated Latin.
Right.
I have no idea where that's going. Like the omniscient Lord himself has no idea where that's going. So like this is just as a disaster. Like don't do that, right? And then this other one, this is in a paper that I rejected. they said, in this paper, I will defend divine timelessness by supplementing it with eternalism. And then they never once mentioned eternalism ever in the paper. And so it's like, so you told me you're going to do something, you didn't do it. You don't want that.
Right.
Yeah.
Is it more common to have stuff like the first example in continental philosophy rather than analytic?
Um, it depends because some continental traditions, the thesis is not quite as clear. In other continental traditions, like you do get some pretty clear thesis statements. So I'm a part of this group in Berlin where we're looking at philosophy of emotion and philosophy of religion, and everyone's very clear there. But they're all doing, most of them are doing continental work. There's only a few analytics in that group.
Mhm.
Whereas some other continental groups I've worked with in the English speaking world, they tend to do the beauty of effulgence kind of stuff, and you're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, it's yeah,
All right.
yeah. Okay, so the next important thing you need to do is you need to define your terms. And again, that sounds like really obvious, but oh my gosh, the amount of times you will not see anybody define their terms is just very frustrating. So what I typically do in the first section of any of my papers is I'll just dedicate that just to here's all the terms I need to define. And then if I have to define something later on, then I just give a very quick definition of it then. Because this is very important. When you define your terms very clearly, that avoids a great deal of confusion up front. So what you're doing here is you're just trying to prevent any sort of confusion from your audience, so that way they are forced to deal with your argument. And if you do not define your terms, then I, as a reader, have no idea what you're talking about. So here's some examples of this. So the first one is all sin against an infinite God is infinitely heinous and worthy of infinite punishment. And no one, like, I mean, it's very rare that you'll find people actually define infinity in a theology paper. And and I think there's at least three different meanings of infinity in this sentence. So this is like a massive equivocation. And if you're not going to tell me what infinity is, then I don't know what you're saying in the sentence. This next one is this is from an actual academic seminar that I attended in, well, I won't say where because I don't want to name and shame. But so the speaker said that they were going to be working with a post-metaphysical judicial ontology with the ethical. And I have no idea what that could possibly mean. And the author never said what that meant. And when I asked her in a Q&A, I was like, what does that phrase mean? And he didn't really know either. He just kept saying, well, I said with the ethical, as if that somehow helped. So what you want to avoid is this very common phenomenon I have when I'm in an academic seminar where I ask a theologian, just what do you mean by that? And then they realize they don't know what they're talking about. They don't have a definition of their terms. That's bad. You want to avoid that. So just define your terms. Now, you need to know how to argue well. And part of arguing well is you need to know your audience. And so, as a good rule of thumb, you always need to assume that your audience is stupid. Like they're just very dumb. Always assume that your audience knows absolutely nothing. And what forces you to do is you have to say exactly what you mean, and you have to mean exactly what you say, because you cannot assume that the audience is in your head, because they're not. If you've got some important information floating around in your head, don't leave it there. You got to put it in the paper, if that makes sense. Um, so like, for example, like you might have to say something like, well, I'm assuming the general theory of relativity is true for this paper. So Emmanuel Asani is a molecular biologist, and we co-wrote a paper on molecular biology and open theism. And she had never written for a philosophical audience before. And so what we did when we were writing this paper is she would send me like her sections, and then I would go through them and go, I don't know what this is. I don't know what this is, because I don't know all this molecular biology stuff. I don't have a PhD in that. She does. So I would say, just what does this mean? And she's like, you want me to define that? You don't know what that is? I'm like, no. And then we go through other stuff. She's like, you're telling me some philosophers won't know that? I'm like, no, they won't. No one's going to know a lot of this biology stuff. So it was very amazing for her to realize like how much basic biology she needed to define in order to make the paper readable. But we got a really good paper in the end because everybody can follow along, even if they don't really know, a lot of molecular biology. Now, again, you have to assume that your audience is stupid. You really do. Like, I cannot stress this enough. Like, because here's a common problem that readers will do. They are very impatient when you're watching a lot of like big like some of the biggest names in Christian apologetics. Like, they don't read anything, but they comment on everything. Academics are the same way. Like, they will start making assumptions about what you're trying to say. They're going to start trying to figure out how to rebut your argument before you've even said anything. So here's some examples from I get this all the time. So a reviewer will like comment on my paper and say, on page 2, you said this. Well, I'm going to need to see an argument for that, to which I have to reply, yeah, it's called page 3, learn how to read. But you can't say that out loud, even though I just did, because it needs to be said. Here's what you do to prevent this. So remember in my thesis statement that I showed earlier, I said in section 1, I'm going to do this. In section 2, I'll do this. In section 3, I'll do. You say all that up front because that kind of helps the reader anticipate that you're going to be doing this sort of thing later on. You're telling them, by the way, I'm going to address this issue later on. And then you have to add in some sentences throughout your paper every once in a while to remind the reader, be like, I haven't argued for this yet, but I'm going to in section, whatever. This is going to help a lot of impatient readers slow down and force them to actually consider what you're saying instead of just trying to jump to conclusions. Now, a lot of analytic philosophers, they like to put their arguments in numbered steps in order to get maximal transparency of the argument. That way, you know exactly what my argument is because it's right there, like numbered steps. And so, I mean, you see this all the time. So, like, whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause for its existence. Right there, the reader should now go, okay, that's exactly what the argument is. If I want to reject something, I have to pick, 1 or 2 to reject and explain why I reject it. You don't always have to do that though. So a lot of times I won't always put it in numbered form. So here's an example of something you can do. So you just say, Eunomius's argument is quite simple. Whatever is caused to exist is not God. This is because God is all se, or does not have a cause for his existence. The doctrine of the Trinity says that the Son is caused to exist, hence the Son is not God. And so you've got all the premises of the argument there, stated very clearly, because I said, here's the argument. So even though there's no numbers, you can still see that's exactly where the argument is, because I said, here's the argument. Okay, citations. There are a lot of reasons you need to properly cite things. There's the obvious reasons, like to avoid plagiarism, to demonstrate that you actually know your sources, but there's other reasons as well. And the main reason is because you need to prevent your readers from making very silly objections, because you have to remember readers are stupid. They do not know what they're talking about most of the time. So here's a common objection I get to a lot of my work. They'll say, no classical theist has ever said that. You're just attacking a straw man. To which I usually have to reply, like, I gave all these direct quotes from all these classical theists saying those things that they did in fact say, and then I've got like 150 citations in a single paper. Like, they certainly said those things. I quoted them. Can you please address the argument? Like, I do this to try to prevent these sort of silly objections that I get. And when I get these silly objections, that's when I usually know someone didn't read the paper, because they would see all the quotes there in the copious citations. There's some different tools you can use to help you with citations. This is really boring, but like Microsoft Word has a nice built-in tool that I use. Zotero has another one. The boring part is you have to put all the bibliographic information in. And that's just painfully dull. But like, once it's in there, and it makes all your future citations very easy. So start putting in citations now. Okay, so last kind of topic here, how to do the research. So clarity on a topic, that takes time, and developing a really clear thesis, that takes a lot of time. Often writing a clear thesis, that's the last thing that I do, because I've got to figure out exactly like what's going on in my head and figure out how to get it on paper. And so I usually have to go back and revise my thesis statement. And the reason is because good research is a gradual process. It's not something you do overnight. But one of the scariest things for me, at least, is when I'm staring at a blank page. And so what I try to do is I try to get stuff on the page right away. So what I do is I create a blank document then I put questions in there that I'm trying to answer. So like, why would God create anything at all? Here's a question about the problem of for the Trinity. Here's this or that. And so I've got all these questions. And then as I'm reading different books, reading different articles, I pull quotes and put them into the relevant sections of the document I've created. And then when I'm inspired, I write like down some of my thoughts on the quote. And then after a while, I've got enough content I can manipulate into a paper. Or at some point, I find myself with an 80,000 word document that I have to cut down to 30,000 words and then turn it into the book God in Emotion. So here's an example. This is from a book that I'm writing at the moment called Models of God and Problems of Creation. So one of the big questions is why create anything at all? And so what you see here is I've got some notes to myself of like what to enter. And then you can see I've got like Keith Ward. Here's what Keith Ward says about the topic. And then Augustine. Here's what Augustine says about the topic. So all I'm doing at this stage is I've got a question and I'm just kind of documenting here's what a lot of different people have said. And later on, I'm going to put it into, an actual like argument and stuff. But this is just the first stage. Now, here's another pro tip. So people have very bad memories, and most people have very terrible reading comprehension skills. And then also these academic books, they're insanely expensive. So you have to rely on a library. And which is great because then you get a lot of books. But the bad thing about a library is you have to return the book. So you can't always have that book in front of you when you're writing a paper. So to overcome this, what I do is I take handwritten notes on what I read. And it helps me with my reading comprehension skills. It helps me remember what I've read. And then I have all the info that I need after I've returned the book to the library. So here's just a terrible picture of like one of my notes. So you can see at the top, I've got the author's name, I've got the full book title, I've got all the bibliographic information, and then you see in the margins, I've got the page numbers, and I'm just taking notes on like what I'm reading. It slows me down, slows down my reading time, but it helps me comprehend exactly what I'm reading a lot better. And then I can keep going back through to my notes and see like, okay, here's where these arguments were. Here's some quotes that I need. One final pro tip. So especially if you're like a student, a lot of times you've got a hard deadline of when a paper's due. In academia, you often have a hard deadline of when a paper is due to a publisher, but publishers know that academics are terrible at time management skills, so they often know that they're going to have to extend the deadline. But as a student, you don't have that luxury. So you don't always have time to read a bunch of books. So what you should do is know this. So a lot of contemporary authors, they publish journal articles, and then those articles later become the basis of a book. So if you need the ideas really fast, you read the journal article. If you think you need some more, then you can go read the book. But the journal article is usually going to be good enough. And so that's all I've got from that presentation.
All right, that was very good, actually. And one question I have is, so when you take notes in this Word document, right, that you try to answer a question, is that question necessarily formed to be a thesis of a paper, or not necessarily?
No. So when I was doing my PhD thesis, this is when I first started doing this kind of method. I had some different questions that I put in there, and I guess I was still trying to figure out exactly what is my thesis. Like my thesis was God and time, but like, what's the exact question? I don't know. As I'm doing all the research, I start discovering lots of questions I didn't even know were important to ask, and so then that starts getting put into the document as well. Of going, oh gosh, here's another question I didn't realize needs to be asked. And throughout that process, then I was able to finally develop, here's what my clear thesis statement is. I want to say like, God, is God timeless? That's my big question. Here are the different theories on time. Are they consistent with any of those? It took a while to get to that stage because as I'm reading, I'm finding all sorts of other issues I didn't even think about. So that becomes, and then sometimes too, like as the documents grow, you don't want it to be too big, and so that becomes a separate document, and then it ends up becoming a chapter, like in a book or something. So it just kind of grows, which is what you want when you're trying to figure out how to write things.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, and I like that you write clearly. I think that's the main advantage of analytic philosophy of religion and analytic theology. Um, Although you mentioned that some continentals also, well, right?
Some are clear, and then some,
Not
yeah,
really, right? Some
yeah,
are.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
But we don't need to talk about that. But one of the
but-
things I do to try to help with the clarity is I write very short sentences.
mhm.
So when my new book, Eternal in Love, a little book about a big God, when that comes out in a few months, you're going to see I do that very consistently, very short sentences, because especially for English speaking audiences, like we don't think in like a single sentence that's like 5 lines long. Like, that's a Latin sort of romance language thing. We don't do that. So we want our sentences very short and sweet. And so I think it helps a lot when you're writing in English to make your sentences shorter.
Mhm. Uh, and I think my view is that those who write these um, big words that they don't clearly define, like the example you gave, the post-metaphysical ethical thing, right?
Yeah.
I think this could be a sign of pseudo-intellectualism in a sense, right? That they're hiding um, what they mean because they're not really sure what they believe, or it's not even something that sophisticated in the first place. So they kind of
Yeah.
have to use this language to make it seem better.
Yeah. That's a common problem in theology, because you'll have a lot of people who hide behind these really profound sounding statements. And because it sounds so profound and I can't quite figure out what the meaning is, it must be really, really important. It's a guru kind of thing. It's not real
Exactly.
intellectual stuff. And that was something I had to learn the hard way during my PhD, where I kept looking at these thinkers and some of the different speakers that would come, and I'm like, everyone's acting like they're really brilliant. But when I'd ask, what does this mean? What does this mean? And eventually my classmates would go, oh, maybe there's no meaning here. And I'm like, yeah, was this really as brilliant as we thought? Like what's going on?
Exactly. So the real intellectual thing, in a sense, is to be straight to the point and clear, right?
I think so. Yeah.
So it's the opposite of what they think or what, a lot of people seem to be doing in academia.
Yeah.
Of course, not everybody. But yeah, that's why I like reading philosophers like you. I like William Lane Craig. I like Alvin Plantinga. These people seem, straight to the point.
On
And
that
this
note,
has
I think
been very
Heidegger.
helpful to me.
You think
What?
And
Heidegger?
yeah, I think Heidegger's like good friend on this too,
Yeah. Yeah.
So Justin, do you have any questions?
I don't have any at the moment, but
Okay.
like I will at like 2 a.m. Oh my God, I
Sure.
probably should
Yeah.
have asked that.
Okay. So another question I have is how frequently do you write? Because you have published a lot actually. So do you write
Yeah.
like almost every day for hours or not really?
It varies. So I've had a lot of research positions early on in my career. So I had a lot of free time to do that. And then the job I have right now with Lucerne, it's really great because I have a lot of time to do research, and then a lot of time to just have like personal one-on-one meetings with my students to help them with their research. So it
Mm-hmm.
allows me a lot of freedom to think about these issues. But yeah, I'll go through these phases where I'll do nothing but read just for like a month or two. And then
Mm-hmm.
I'll go through other phases where I can't stop writing. It just kind of happens. So when I was at the University of Helsinki, I had 2 years there. And for the I'd say first semester I was there, I did some writing, but it was just lots and lots of reading. And then after that, it was difficult to read anything because I was writing so much. I couldn't stop writing. Um, and then I was able to pump out like 2 books that are coming out this year, and a lot of articles and things. So it was good, but yeah, it just kind of comes and goes.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Some people have to force themselves to write though. Like that's a like I noticed that a lot during my PhD was some people they're just terrified of the blank page, which is when I know a lot of people get scared of that blank page. So that's why I gave the advice that I did. So what
Mm.
some of my classmates had to do was they would just have to dedicate like an hour a day to just writing anything. It doesn't matter if it's absolute garbage of whatever you spewed onto paper, just that you wrote something. So
Mhm.
for some people, that's just what they need.
Okay, and
which
then they
makes sense.
start the process of writing, I guess. And out of
Yeah.
that, maybe they will start writing better stuff. And then,
Yeah. Yeah. Like I remember Stephen Weikstra. He's done a lot of work on the problem of evil, philosophy of science. He's the one who kind of gave us this whole skeptical theism solution to the evidential problem of evil. Like Weikstra, I worked with him a bit at Notre Dame. He had a research fellowship there. And he was one of these guys where he's like, yeah, I just have to write down some word vomit, like at the beginning, you know. And he's like, it's that process of just saying absolute nonsense and then fighting really hard with those words until you figure out, I now know exactly what I'm saying. And so
Mhm.
what Professor Weichster told me was he has to go through that in order to get that really nice clarity that you see in his writing style.
Mhm.
Is you have to wrestle with your own self going, what am I saying here? Gosh, am I just talking about a post-judicial metaphysical ontology? What am I doing? You know, you have to wrestle with yourself sometimes.
And what about things like grammar or format? Do you edit that at the end, or are you trying to
I
get it right while writing it?
uh, I'm one of those who edits later,
Mhm.
because I got to get the ideas down. Some people edit as they're going. What I've noticed now that I've been writing for so long is the grammar comes better now, and my style. I figured out how to know when to break grammatical rules. And some publishers, I've discovered which ones will let me tell jokes and which ones won't. So I know when I can sneak a joke in here or there, and which like journal is going to be like, you got to get rid of that, and which journal is going to go, no, that was hilarious and that's really good, so keep it. You know, like so that part it just kind of, I think it comes later.
Okay, that's fair. Because a problem I've noticed in my kind of writing is that I don't really edit the grammar much until the very end. But
Mhm.
then I have like 4,000 words that have all kinds of errors.
Yeah,
And that's also kind of, but it's fine, I guess. It's,
yeah, because it's just the first draft. It doesn't matter. You're the only one
right.
who sees it. You know, it's not like you're sending that to your
Yeah.
teacher or the publisher or anything. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, it doesn't
And
matter.
the ideas are already written down, right? So that's the important stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like I said, that blank page is the enemy. You don't want that. So yeah, just get stuff down on
Exactly.
paper.
Um, and when you are not writing or reading, do you still think about the writing process or other stuff in philosophy, like thinking, oh, what else should I do? Like, what's the next kind of topic I should work on? Like, do you? I remember reading this somewhere that you like it was some piece of advice that you kind of have to live all the time like you are a philosopher and writing stuff, right? Is this true or not necessarily?
It varies. There are times in my life where I can't turn it off. Like I just get so obsessed with an idea. I'm like, I really need to figure this out. And that I have to just write things down furiously just to get it out. And then I can go do anything else. It's very important that you do anything else, because you're a human, you need to have
Right.
like a well-balanced life. Like that in and of itself is important. Also, you could just get really stuck on something and you don't know what to do, and just focused on anything else, like go for a jog, or go for a walk or lift weights or something, or just go to a heavy metal show just because it's fun.
Go
And
shoot a
then the
gun.
ideas, yeah, exactly, the ideas will come later, you know, like
Right. I think that's good. Um, so Justin, you don't have anything to say about the writing stuff?
I mean, the only like question that came to mind was like, what do you think of like um grammar checking programs like Grammarly and stuff like that? Using that while like writing.
oh yeah, I've not used these. I've had students use them quite a bit, and they found them very useful.
Mhm.
Whereas I just know my grammar is not great, and I don't care. I'm like, this is RT Mullins. This is what you get. You know, like I've reached
Right.
that stage now where I could just be like, yeah, I screw up my tenses sometimes. What do you want? You know,
What you
like
see
But I
is
think,
what you get.
yeah, yeah,
but I think these days we gotta be careful with them because maybe the writing will get flagged as written by AI, right? If
Yeah.
it's too perfect or something.
yeah. That
Oh
is
no,
because
I'm not sure.
that can be, and I know that some of the other universities I've worked at, like in Finland, for instance, they would have an English language like lab or office that would check
Mhm.
your writing to make sure, but they would give you like the notes of like, here's things you need to fix. So I know some universities do that, which I think is totally fine, because you do need someone else, especially when you're writing in something that's not your first language, like
Mhm.
that's really hard, and so you definitely need help. I have a
Yeah.
lot of colleagues in Germany and in Finland and in Italy that will ask me, "Can you please look at this paper for me and tell me how does this sound to a native English speaker?" Um,
Mhm.
I think that's really good to get that kind of help from others.
And do you recommend actually trying to publish a few different papers on the same topic, broadly speaking, or you deal with one topic, then you completely get rid of it, and then you
Some topics I felt like this is all I had to say.
okay.
So I did a paper on disability and the resurrection. That was the first paper I ever published.
Mm-hmm.
And I had two things that I came away with. One was I don't really have a whole lot more to say on this topic. And then two, this is a community of like just intellectually vicious like people. Like this is not like a good epistemic environment. These are not people I can argue with. So I was just like, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. Whereas some
Wait,
other topics,
who were
so
these academically
so
vicious people?
like the disability theologians, they like try to hide behind this rhetoric of I'm taking the disabled perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And since I was arguing for a perspective that is well represented in the Special Olympics community in my hometown that I participate in a lot because my sister has Down
Mm-hmm.
syndrome, they were all like, Ryan, we love what you're saying. But the disability theologians were like, you're just an ableist. You're just an ableist. And I'm like, I'm oppressing disabled people. Yes, very good, very good. So it's just a kind of nonsense. I'm like,
Right.
I don't want to be a part of this.
Right.
So that was kind of separate reasons why I
Yeah.
didn't write more on the topic. But some other topics, yeah, like I wrote stuff on divine simplicity ages ago, and the reactions were so gross that I was like, I don't want to have to do this ever again. But then I had a lot of people just saying like, no, these arguments are really important that you need to develop them. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
it took a few years of convincing me. I was like, fine, I'll write more on it. So I have, and now I'm going to be in a debate book on the topic. But that one is another one where it was the reactions where I'm like, you're not interested in the arguments, so
Mm.
I don't want
Yeah,
to. You know,
I remember from your podcast that people keep telling you that, oh, you haven't really read Aquinas, or you don't understand Aquinas, or like rather than
yeah,
actually dealing with your arguments against divine simplicity.
yeah.
Um,
And
I
especially
do.
too that it wasn't like the worst cases were they would be complaining about a section of my book when you're like, you don't understand Aquinas. I'm like, this is a section on John Philoponus. This isn't even about it. What are you talking about? And so I'm like, oh, you're just not reading. Okay, this is
Yeah,
good. Good.
yeah. Actually, I've had similar experiences because I was writing for a class. I don't want to give out the name of the class,
Yeah.
but my professor was a classical theist who's also a Calvinist, right? So he was very much against, let's say, neoclassical theism, right? Which I do affirm, right? Uh, so basically, the notes on the paper were that, oh, this is not really Aquinas and stuff like this. But I'm not even trying to do Aquinas scholarship, right? I'm just getting the definition of
Hmm.
divine simplicity, which is from Aquinas, and then I'm trying to make some argument against it, right? Shouldn't this be fine in itself?
It should be. Yeah. I mean, because what you need is the claim.
Yeah.
And this is a common thing I've noticed. There's kind of a disconnect sometimes between well, Thomism is a different case because what you have, so there's this guy named Herbert McCabe who
Mhm.
I thought was a Thomist, and he's a very clear writer. He's a very brilliant writer, actually. He was at Oxford in the 20th century. He apparently said he didn't want to be labeled as a Thomist because he thought the Thomist crowd was just awful. It's like these like they're basically just worshiping whatever their own version of
Yeah.
Aquinas is, and I work with a lot of medieval scholars, and they make similar statements of like it's just frustrating. They're just like, here's what I think Aquinas said. I don't want to engage with Thomism. And I'm like, fair enough.
Mm.
But I'll see this not just in that crowd. I'll see it a lot in anybody who's doing a lot of more historical theology.
Mhm.
They don't want you critiquing their thinker unless you've like shown you've read everything. So basically what you have to do before you're allowed to critique somebody, it's like you have to write like 4 books just on what they thought, and then maybe you can write a paper where you critique them, and you're like, that's excessive. No.
Exactly. I agree with you. I remember some of my professors were stuck on some big philosophers, right? They were obsessed with Aristotle or whatever. And every time I tried to argue against one of their points, I'm not even making like a full criticism of Aristotle. I'm not even attacking Aristotle per se. Just one particular point I'm arguing against it. And they were kind of like, going nuts,
Yeah.
which, and it's the same thing in theology. I guess it makes sense, similar in some ways. But okay, so should we go to the other sort of topic I wanted to discuss? Okay, so the previous time you were in the podcast, we talked about models of God, right? And a lot of them, especially about classical theism and neoclassical, then we spent a lot of time. What we didn't talk much about was pantheism, in particular Christian pantheism, because I think you made the claim that some people think that you could have Christian pantheism, which is theologically orthodox, right?
Yeah, I've seen this claim before. Yeah.
So what do you think of this?
This is something I've been struggling to figure out in my head. And so, like I mentioned earlier, I'm slowly writing a book called Models of God and Problems of Creation. And I want to give a closer examination of pantheism in that book, because that's the only model of God I've not written extensively on. I've written on all the other models quite a lot, but not that one. So there's different versions of pantheism, supposedly, that I'm trying to sort through. At least that's the claim. So the most popular versions are usually there's just one thing that exists, and it's God. That's it. Just one substance. And everything else is just identical to that substance. And that can lead to some weird stuff. Like, because it might entail like, I'm identical to you. I'm identical to this chair I'm sitting on. I'm identical to like this whiskey cabinet that's next to me. In my,
modal collapse in a sense, right?
You do get that, because that's what you have in Spinoza. And he's upfront about it. He's just like, yeah, modal collapse. What do you want? Who cares? Whereas most people are like, no, I care a lot. But what you can do with some of these, there's different nuances you'll see. You'll see people go, well, you're identical to God in the sense of there's just one entity, one substance that exists, but you're just a mode of God. And you're like, okay, because like a thing has properties, it has modes, it has this or that. So you're a mode of God. And you're like, tell me more what this is. And you'll get these weird analogies of like, well, imagine there's a carpet, like a rug, and there's bumps in the rug. You're a bump in the rug. You're a bump in God. And you're like, okay, I feel like I'm more than that, but sure.
But also, people are sinners, right? Like they do morally wrong things. So if they're part of God, is God only benevolent and all good?
This is an objection I laid out in this book called Value Beyond Monotheism by Kurt Lougheed. And I was asked to argue for panentheism in that book, and I do the best I can. But there's a few pantheist chapters in there too. But one of the arguments I lay out to go, okay, since my job is to say panentheism is the best one, I got to explain why. Like all the other models are terrible. And so when I look at pantheism, I go, well, hang on. I'm sinning, but we're supposed to say God's perfectly good. Then God's sinning. If I'm God, then God's sinning. Like, and then there's some moves you could try to make to say, well, nah, not really. Like, God's not approving of all these actions that are taking place within himself. And I'm like, well, then is God schizophrenic? Does God have multiple personality disorder? This doesn't sound like the kind of maximal unity that a lot of pantheists argue for. So we've got a very serious moral problem, and then we've got now this problem for some kind of meaningful sense of unity. And a unity argument is very important for a lot of pantheists, because they want to say there's this maximal unity in reality. It's God. And that's supposed to be an argument in their favor. And so now I'm kind of being able to poke holes in that and question, how much unity is there if God's like constantly disagreeing with himself? It seems weird.
Okay, that's interesting. So would you say that it's probably implausible, right? Like Christian
I
pantheism.
think it's
but-
implausible, but let me try to do a little bit to help out.
Mhm.
So say like you're a Trinitarian, and I think the guy's name is Don Ladinsky. He's got a paper on this. There's somebody else too. His name's gone now. Where they're trying to argue like here's a Trinitarian pantheism. So you've got the Trinitarian God, and then you say everything else is somehow constituted out of the Trinitarian God. And I'm like, okay, if that's coherent, if the Trinity is coherent, and if some sort of constitution relation is coherent, then I'm like, okay, you've got this up and running. So I'm part of the same stuff of God. And so that's the sense in which I am God. I'm made of the same stuff. If you can make coherent sense of that, then you can start making coherent sense of a lot of other things. You could have, Jesus became incarnate in the sense of like he took a particular form, took on a particular mode. If I'm a mode of God, then the God the Son was like, okay, I'll just kind of take a mode here. If you want life after death, well, I got life right now. If God can somehow pull that off and pantheism be coherent, then he can pull off a life after death. So I think if you're able to establish the coherency of like those basic pantheistic claims, then then I think you can make a lot of traction to get the rest of like the Christian story or an Islamic story, a Jewish story, whatever you want.
Okay, yeah.
Question I have is like, what passages from scripture would like a pantheist use to like use as support for this?
Yeah, no, it's yeah, because it seems like didn't he kind of create a bunch of stuff? Doesn't that kind of suggest he's not these? Yeah. So the most famous one you'll get is the passage in Acts 17. In him we live and move and have our being. And panentheists will also love that's their favorite passage. Neoclassical theists like Isaac Newton, that was one of his favorite passages. So everyone loves this passage, but they're trying to make it fit these radically different views. So you could say like, yeah, like I have life and existence in him. He's the only thing that exists. So my existence in some sense is fully dependent on him, on God. So is that really satisfying? I'm not commenting on whether that's satisfying. I'm just telling you that's what they'll say.
Okay. I think a lot of people when they get into Christianity, they kind of assume something like classical theism, right? But it's not really something from the Bible, right? It came from maybe philosophy, maybe a bunch of other stuff too. So are most academics today classical theists? Like not, I mean, in philosophy there are a lot of atheists, but those who are theists, are most of them classical theists?
I don't really know because a lot of people will say they're a classical theist, but they just mean I affirm that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and just on the omnis. Like that's it. That's all they mean. So they're not really using it in this more technical sense. And I've noticed that a lot. And so one of the things, that's why I put such a big emphasis in my research project to go, here's these different models. Let's clarify that. And I think that's really helped a lot. Because a lot of people are like, yeah, I'm classical, meaning I affirm something traditional. I'm like, well, do you affirm impassibility? Well, no, that's not in the Bible. Oh, okay. Then okay. Do you affirm that God's timeless? Maybe. And then you start asking questions. They're like, yeah, God does one thing and then another. I'm like, oh, you just don't know what timelessness means. Okay, cool. So like this is a common thing you'll see. In my experience, most people think they have some like bits and pieces of the classical picture of God. But either they don't, or they'll just affirm some of it, but not all of it. They'll reject other things. So like impassibility is a pretty common one, because a lot of theologians have read their Bible. And so the idea that God does not have empathy, that God's not moved by you in any way, that just seems very implausible to a lot of
Right.
people. Whereas
Yeah.
something like timelessness, because time is such a weird topic, they're just like, yeah, I guess he's timeless. I don't know, relativity or something. Einstein said something, maybe. I don't know. Like that's the kind of thing I'll get.
Yeah. So it's not too common for people to think that God is temporal.
Not as much that one, because I think the topic of God and time is just so difficult to get your head around. When I explain to a lot of people, all it means is that God does one thing and then another. Like that's really the rock bottom claim, and God exists right now. A lot of people go, oh, well, what's the big deal about that? I'm like, there is no big deal. Like,
Exactly.
like it's fine. Of course, there's lots of objections people will have, but but in my mind, I'm like, I dealt
Now,
with them all.
the difference between your view and the view of William Lane Craig is you claim God always was temporal, right?
Mhm.
While Craig claims he wasn't, and then he became temporal, right?
Kind of. You can't have the and then he became,
Ah,
because then you're going to have that's a temporal relation.
right.
So you'd have time before time. And Craig, so this is why Craig says God is timeless without the universe, but temporal with the universe.
Okay.
So that way he can avoid any before and after. That way he can avoid saying and then, because then you're going to have. So he was timeless.
Hmm.
When was he timeless? Like that
Right.
sounds like. And this is a very ancient problem.
Is this why they talk about logical moments rather than temporal moments or something like that? Or is this?
Partly. Um, so in the history of philosophical theology, you get this problem about God's timeless free will. So there's this thing called the necessity of the present. Like right now, I'm sitting. It's too late to be doing anything else. But you might be like, well, what's the big deal? At the next moment, you could do something else. I'm like, yeah, at the next moment, I could do something. But right now, it's too late. I'm already sitting. So it's necessary that I'm sitting in the sense of the necessity of the present. And it's not a problem for our free will because, again, at the next moment, we could do whatever. If you're looking at a timeless God, a God who just exists at just a single timeless now that lacks a before and after and that has no succession, whatever God's doing, he's doing. It's too late to do anything else. He doesn't have another moment at which he could do things. So you've got this necessity of the present that actually is a very serious problem for God's free will. And so trying to figure out, well, how can we get any sort of freedom for a timeless God is a major problem throughout Western history. And what John Duns Scotus does is he introduces these things he calls instants of nature or logical moments. And this has a huge impact on like Mullinism, on Calvinism, on all these like later like doctrines. And so what he does is he asks, okay, when would God perform like a free action? And he's like, well, maybe there's these things called these logical moments, and they're embedded in a single timeless moment. So at the first logical moment, God's completely undecided. Will I create a universe or not? I don't know. I've not decided yet. And at the next logical moment, God deliberates. He considers his options. And at the moment after that, he makes a choice to actually create this universe. And thus he knows all the stuff at that moment. And this is all supposed to take place within a single timeless moment. So that's where that stuff comes from. And is that coherent? I can explain why I don't think it is in a second. But that's where it comes from. And then you'll get a lot of this used to try to talk about God as being like logically prior in some sense. This is a lot of where this logic comes from. Not all of it, but a lot of it.
Okay. Now, to those that claim that God can't always be temporal because of infinite regress or something like that, right? What's your response?
So there's two kind of responses. I'll tell you what they both. I'll tell you the first one, which is a very popular one in history, and then I'll tell you mine. So the first one, you'll see this in like Samuel Clarke. You'll see this in William Hasker today, and they'll just kind of go, "What's the problem with God undergoing an infinite number of moments before He creates? What's the big deal? Who cares?" They just shrug their shoulders, like I don't see the problem. Whereas like I really see the problem. I'm like all the Kalam kind of arguments of these infinite regresses, like not explaining anything. How would God ever get to the point where he's able to create? Why didn't God create sooner? There's like a whole huge network of problems that I think you encounter if you just kind of shrug your shoulders. And throughout like Jewish, Christian, Islamic history, just a massive series of problems. And so what I do is I look very closely at the definition of what does it mean to begin to exist? And what it means to begin to exist historically, not just in the Western religions, but also in the Eastern religions, is that a thing begins to exist when it is preceded by non-existence. So first there's nothing and then there's something. So what I'd say is there's a first moment. of time, because a moment of time is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. So God all alone, by himself, is a way things are, and it could be subsequently otherwise, because he could do something at the next moment. That's the first moment. Did it begin to exist? No, it's not preceded by non-existence. It's just there. When will it cease to be? It ceases to be when God does something subsequently otherwise, when God makes things be otherwise. That's when you get to transition to the next moment. So I don't have this infinite regress. I just got a single moment at the beginning that ever began. And there's some precedent for this. I'm not the first person to say this. So this guy named al-Baghdadi in the Islamic tradition in like the 1000s, if I remember correctly, or maybe it was the 10th century. I don't. He has this view and it looks remarkably like Richard Swinburne's view, because Richard Swinburne and Dean Zimmerman also have something very similar to the view I just articulated. So I'm not the first person to come up with this. I'm just trying to refine the details as best as I can.
Okay. Justin, you have anything to say?
No, on this topic.
Okay. Now another question I wanted to ask you is, so there's the general problem of suffering, and there are a few responses to that, but there's another kind of argument that I think they call it something like extreme and unnecessary suffering.
Mhm.
That it's a lot more suffering, and maybe there doesn't seem to be much of a reason for it, like a baby being born with some disease, like something like that. So, do you have a response to this sort of stuff?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question is gratuitous suffering. So suffering that there's no real reason for it. There's no good reason for it. What the focus on gratuitous suffering is trying to do is say, if you've got a theodicy, like a greater good theodicy or something, and God's got a good reason for permitting this to take place, and it's connected to some greater good, and then you point to some instance of suffering, like the disease case you pointed out, and go, how could this possibly be connected to a greater good? No greater good I can think of would this be able to be connected to. And you've got two different options. One is you could go the skeptical theist route and say, well, yeah, there's no good reason that I know of, but I know enough about myself and I know enough about the ways different goods and evils combine. They just keep going and all these like huge number of combinations. I know that I can't possibly figure all that out. So based on what I know, I have good reason to be skeptical that I should be able to figure out what God's good reason is to allow this. That's the skeptical theist answer. What William Hasker points out is this is assuming something called a meticulous account of providence, where every single instance in history is going to be connected to some sort of greater good. It might be connected to the greater good immediately, or maybe like way down the road, but it's going to be somehow connected to a greater good. So there's a specific benefit policy that God has when he's governing the world. What Hasker does is he says, well, let's get rid of that. Like, why wouldn't God have a more general providence? On a general theory of providence, God has a basic reason for keeping the basic structures of the universe up and running. And there's a series of reasons why God would have have that. One would be to help people build their souls. Another would be just because life in general has like intrinsic value. But not everything that happens in a world where creatures have genuine causal power is going to have some sort of specific benefit to a greater good. Like God's approach here on this general theory of providence is much more general. Like it's so what you're assuming up front is God's creating a universe where he knows that there's going to be gratuitous suffering that's going to be inevitable, because that's the kind of universe needed to create. If you're going to give creatures like genuine causal power to really be able to do whatever,
Right.
that just entails the very possibility of gratuitous suffering. So you should expect there to be gratuitous suffering. You shouldn't think that each case is, there's not going to be any gratuitous suffering in the world. Like that's the kind of response that you'll see from like Hasker and some others.
Okay. So it's not really metaphysically possible, let's say, to have like free will humans or persons or whatever that don't have this kind of suffering.
That's Hasker doesn't go quite that far. Because like Alvin Plantinga, like, you know, Alvin Plantinga has this idea of trans-world depravity,
Right.
that like no matter what kind of world God would create, if he gives creatures free will, like they're gonna fall. Hasker's pretty critical of that idea. So I think Hasker's going to make a more minimal claim. I think it should be something more like this. If God's trying to create a universe with the kinds of creatures we see in this universe, not just humans, but like the whole like wide
Right.
scope of like single-celled organisms onto like different levels of complexity. If you're going to create a universe like that, the only way you can really do that is if you have this more general providential approach to it,
Right.
which entails the possibility of gratuitous suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Now, another question I have is, we have talked previously about the Cambridge Platonists, right? Who they claim God doesn't have a location. Oh, no, they claim God has a location.
Right.
It's
Yeah, they didn't
the
like when Descartes said God had no location. Yeah.
exactly. But then the question would be, where is that location, right? Is it
Yeah.
inside the physical? Is it in the physical world or out? Like, could be outside. Like, how does it work exactly?
Yeah. So if you so Henry Moore is one of the people you want to look at. Jonathan Lionheart has a book called Space God that's in the book series that I'm co-editing with John Peckham. And he goes into the details of this a lot more. I'm still trying to think through it. So I'll give you some options. So one thing you could say is God creates space. And so where is God? God's located at every single spatial location. He's just there. And you could go, well, is he outside of space? And you're like, well, what does it mean to be outside of what? There's just this thing, space. Like outside sounds like there's like more space out there. You know, you're just confused. Al Ghazali has a discussion on this when he's looking at some objections to creation ex nihilo. He's like, you're talking about above and below as if there's something like more space. You know, no, stop it. There's this is the space and that's it. So you'd be like,
Okay.
God's everywhere. What you could do is what people like Henry Moore do and Isaac Newton do, is space is a divine attribute. So God doesn't create space. And if space is infinite, then you could say that God is literally everywhere because he just is the everywhere. And you are located in a place within space. And so God's there too, because God is the space, but God's also these other infinite number of locations. So the physical universe is just over here, and you could be like, well, what's beyond that? And you're like, a whole lot more space.
Right.
Then you can meaningfully talk about more space.
So, I
So-
guess could this be a form of Christian pantheism, maybe?
I was gonna
Yeah, what were you thinking?
I was gonna say the other direction would be like panentheism more than pantheism.
Correct. Yeah. So in my first paper on panentheism, I didn't realize there were actual people who affirmed that space and time are divine attributes, other than like one guy who kind of said it, named Samuel Alexander in the early 20th century. But I couldn't figure out what he was really saying. So I was like, I don't know. Maybe what it means to be a panentheist is that space and time are divine attributes, and the universe is literally in space and time, so it's literally in God. The reception from panentheists has been mixed on that point, because some of them just want their metaphors. They don't want anything literal. And I'm like, well, then I don't know what you're saying, man. What one guy, Carl Pfeiffer, pointed out to me was, he said, this could be consistent with other models of God as well. It doesn't really say anything that unique about panentheism. And then when I've been tracing down the history, I think that's right. So Samuel Clarke and Isaac Newton and Henry Moore, they affirm creation out of nothing. Whereas almost all, not all, but most panentheists say creation out of nothing is false. So I've got these people who are affirming creation out of nothing, saying space and time are divine attributes, and the universe is in God in that sense. But they're not going to be panentheists because they're affirming creation out of nothing. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it at the moment. if that really works or not, is that going to be convincing to everyone? I have no idea yet.
No, do you affirm the Platonist position, Cambridge Platonist position, that God has a location, or not necessarily?
I don't know yet. I like the claim about time being a divine attribute. I've done a lot, like one of my forthcoming books is really developing that idea. With the space issue, I don't know yet because I just feel like I need to do a lot more research on it. I'm just still trying to get my head around it. Like I felt like I can explain the ideas pretty well, but I feel like I really don't. I just don't. I feel like I don't understand them enough to really develop arguments for and against yet. So give me a few years and maybe we'll see.
Yeah. I think there was some medieval guy, he had this view about sacred space, right? I don't remember his name though. But
There's a lot of different people who talked about this, so I don't.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm not certain.
But could it be useful for this or not necessarily?
If I mean, if space just is a divine attribute, it might be a bit difficult to talk about sacred space because it'd all be sacred in that sense.
Yeah.
So I think sacred space should have to be something that's set apart from everything else in a unique way.
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking maybe somebody could be Cambridge Platonist and also some kind of an idealist, right? So not have space at all.
Or at least not have like physical objects or something.
Yeah.
Or give this mental kind of approach to it. Yeah, like that's yeah, you see that at various points in history. Like some of the Jewish mystics were interested in this. Like Berkeley, of course, is like interested in this. So yeah, it's a view you see. I've got some objections to certain forms of idealism, but other forms I don't know. I just find it really implausible because I'm just like I feel like this physical stuff around me is pretty physical. Like, yeah, I don't. Have you guys heard about G.E. Moore's hand argument against
Yes.
idealism?
I
Okay,
have a hand, another hand.
yeah, I have a hand. I look down and I get another hand. Nothing you can say can convince me otherwise. And I'm like, yeah.
But these hands are ideas, right? In idealism, at least.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, so what are some of your arguments against idealism?
So Sam Liebens, my friend Sam Liebens, and I have a back and forth on this in Philosophia Christi. I think it came out last year. And so Sam is focused on something called Hasidic idealism, focused on like somebody's Jewish mystic version of it. And the Jewish mystical version is a bit stronger, which makes it more interesting, which is why Sam because Sam loves to do like, let's do the really crazy stuff and see what we can go with it. So it's a lot of fun. So on your standard idealism, you'll say there's minds that exist and their ideas. And so God creates a bunch of other minds, and then there's all these ideas floating around, and that's it. On Hasidic idealism, there's just one mind, which is God, and then everything else is God's ideas. So you are just an idea in the mind of God. And Sam has another fun paper called God and His Imaginary Friends, because you're just, just an idea in the mind of God, right? Yeah. So you're an imaginary friend. So like Sam just has this creativity that I just greatly appreciate. I've always appreciated about him. So one of the things I try to argue in against him is to say, well, Sam, you want to affirm creation out of nothing, and creation out of nothing means there's this state of affairs where God exists all alone. Prior to creation, there's God all alone, and I take that definition straight from Sam himself. If it's just God and His ideas, well, God never exists without His ideas. So you're not going to get creation out of nothing. If creation is God's got some ideas, well, God always has His ideas. So there's no meaningful sense where you can get creation out of nothing. That's one problem. The second problem is you get this sort of modal collapse and a modal explosion, because God's ideas, the doctrine of divine ideas, are all the possibilities. All the possible things are divine ideas. Well, all the possible ideas, that's just it. That's all. There's God and His ideas, and that's the only way things could be. So you got a modal collapse, and then everything that could exist does exist because it's just God and His ideas on this view.
Okay.
That's all reality is. And so you're like, oh gosh, now so we've got everything that could possibly exist is just there. So you've got this
Right.
explosion of things.
But this, okay, so this could work against Hasidic idealism where we are ideas in the mind of God, right?
Correct.
But a version of idealism which is maybe a bit closer to Berkeley, where he made a bunch of other minds, right?
Mhm.
I think this doesn't actually, this argument doesn't defeat this version, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't defeat that one. I've been reading a bit of Barclay lately to try to figure out what to do for my book on the problems of creation. And he considers an objection like the one I laid out against Sam. And I did not know that when I was writing the paper. And I was like, oh, man, that's cool. I wish I would have known that sooner. But I just can't, I haven't been able to read it enough to figure out what's going on there and how it really works. But this is a kind of common problem that he thinks he has an answer to. So I'll have to get back to you on what his answer is and if I can refine my
Okay.
argument. But at the moment, I don't think my argument does work against him.
Right.
Because he's gonna say there's minds that come into existence that God creates. Yeah.
Now, okay, this is gonna be a bit controversial, but I think it's gonna be a bit funny too. So,
You win some, you lose some, you know?
yeah. So a very bad example of an academic or a theologian that I have, I think is David Bentley Hart. Right, I think he he writes in an extremely pretentious way, and sometimes doesn't define stuff, or sometimes doesn't get into detail enough. So, and you know, I'm not claiming that I've read every single thing that he has. I'm not claiming that he sucks at every single thing. Maybe he's good at some stuff, bad at some other stuff. But I remember, like, he said his objection to the view of William Lane Craig, right, was that, oh, this is basically super Zeus. He says that it's an all-loving super Zeus. Don't get me wrong, it's all loving, but it's just super Zeus. And I'm thinking, but this is really how you get rid of let's say neoclassical theism, or what he calls a theistic personality. So this is why I don't invite him to the podcast, but I invite you. You know, because it's more. I prefer more clear stuff. What do you think of Bentley Hart?
I don't like the idea that I have to have a thesaurus next to me whenever I'm reading
Mm.
something. Like, I mean, definitely it's the case when you're reading, like you come across things, you're like, I need to look that up really quick. You know, that happens all the time. And you learn a lot of
Right.
words that way. But it seems a bit excessive when you're reading some of his stuff. And I think a lot of it is rhetoric that once you clear through it, you're left going, what's the argument here? So
Yeah.
the case you brought up is a great one where I'm like, I don't understand what the argument is for why I should think that these other models of God just are a super Zeus. Maybe it's because I'm not in Greece, you know, and I've not really gone up to Mount Olympus or something, you know, like, I don't know, but like, I'm just not seeing it. And then when I look at the actual history of ideas in a lot more detail than I think Hart has sufficiently done, I see these models of God throughout history in a way that I don't see recognized as much. And so I'm like, these ideas have been debated for a long time. And everyone's assuming God's perfect. They're trying to figure out what that means. And just because you don't like the other view doesn't mean, well, it must be a creature. You're like, tell me what a creature is. Tell me what a creator is. If you don't know, I wrote a paper called the creator-creature distinction. But, you know, that'll help you out.
Okay, that's interesting. But how would he be a creature if he always existed then? It doesn't even make sense. It's more of a mockery or something.
I think that's all it is. So that's what I did in the creator-creature paper was I was tired of hearing this, oh, you're blurring the distinction between like the creator. And I was like, how? Okay, let's look at what a creator is. A creator is like this necessarily existent eternal being that produces a universe. A universe to be a creature is just to be that stuff that's been produced by God. Okay. Does God get sad sometimes? Sure, why not? Oh, well, now he's a creature. I'm like, how does getting sad sometimes make him not necessarily exist eternal? What are you talking about? Give me an argument. Yeah, and so I look at some different arguments. One of which is hilarious was if God gains the accidental property of being a creator, then he's a creature. And I teased that one out from James Dozel, and I was like, okay, cool. and then I explain why I think it's wrong, but just stating it, going, so the argument is if God gains the property of being a creator, then he's not the creator. Okay, now here's why I think it's wrong. But I think all I need to do is really just say that this is what the argument is.
Yeah, because it's a contradiction. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but by the way, the thing about God not being sad, we talked about this in the previous time you were on the show. But if he has empathy, right?
Mhm.
He empathizes with us. We have sadness, so he gets sadness, right? So in a sense, if he is God and he is maximally great, maybe he should have empathy too, right? So
I think so. Yeah. So Linda Zagzebski has a lot of interesting arguments for this, and I like those. They're really good. One of the arguments I try to develop in my little book about a big God that's going to come out later this year is I go, okay, what does it mean to be omnipotent? To be omnipotent is to have the most power-granting set of abilities and no liabilities, no weaknesses. And then you start identifying different kinds of abilities or powers. Well, cognitive abilities, mental abilities. Maximal cognitive excellency would be things that would cover knowing everything in the right way and being appropriately responsive to reasons. Well, that's going to cover propositional knowledge. That's going to cover emotions. It's going to cover, because having the right kind of emotion is part of what it means to be appropriately responsive to something. Having experiential knowledge, because there's more to know than just propositional facts. So you're not maximally cognitively excellent if you do not have the right kind of experiential knowledge. So I think you're just going to get the affective or the phenomenal states of God just right from this idea of cognitive excellency. And then everything falls out from there.
Okay, that's
At least that's what I try to argue.
So does cognitive excellency include like being rational and good and things like that?
Because if you're appropriately responsive to reasons, one set of reasons that people are responsive to are moral reasons. So God's going to be appropriately responsive to moral reasons and moral facts. So you're going to get perfect rationality. You're going to get perfect morality from that. You're going to get freedom, because what it means to be free is you act for good reasons, and you've got the ability to do otherwise. And you're like, okay, so you can start getting a lot of the divine attributes from this.
Okay, that's an interesting idea. So the cognitive excellence. And I guess, okay, Justin, you have any questions? Or
Kind of,
points?
but like it was like a thing that was brought up earlier that I'm kind of wondering about this time as one of God's attributes or divine attributes like that. Mainly because I read like Bradshaw's paper on like time for his class actually.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I did not know what he meant.
I couldn't figure out what Bradshaw meant either in that paper. But I know on Facebook, when I was getting ready to teach a class on God and time in Florida, I posted like what day one was going to talk about, and day one was going to be time as a divine attribute. And Bradshaw was like, "That sounds really cool. I want to hear more about that. I think that's the Eastern Orthodox position." I'm like, I don't really think it is the Eastern Orthodox position, but I've not read enough to say, so I don't know. But I can tell you what I think it means, because I've been able to trace it down in Western history to some point, like people like Newton and stuff. And then in the Hindu tradition, Raghunatha Shiromani, and then you see it kind of in the Bhagavad Gita. So like trying to trace out some of the history of it. Here's the idea. So time, if you affirm the absolute theory of time, you're saying time is this natured entity that makes change possible. It's the source of moments, and then it's the thing that unifies a series of moments into a coherent timeline. A moment is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. And so a timeline is just, those kind of moments lined up in some way that actually is coherent. So you need a natured entity that is the source of moments, that explains like how change is possible, and explains how you get this series of moments. Well, God is a natured entity, so I'm like, okay, cool, I got that. God is the thing that makes change possible. Why? Because the kind of being that God is all powerful and has perfect freedom. That just entails that things can be other than the way they are, because that's just what it means to have power and freedom. God is the source of moments. Well, God just existing by himself that's a way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. So that just emanates from him, that there's a first moment. Any subsequent moment that God brings about, that's going to be due to divine action, like free action, what God decides to freely do. And then whatever doctrine of providence you want. You could be an open theist, you could be a Calvinist, you could be a Molinist, it doesn't matter. That's your story of how God identifies a set of potential moments and puts them into a coherent timeline. And so you've got God playing this role of all these things, and you're like, okay, well then time is to be identified with God in this sense. That's the move.
Okay.
I know that's a lot to take in, but
Yeah.
but yeah, in my book, The Divine Time Maker, which hopefully will come out at the end of this year. It depends how quickly the copy editing gets done. It'll go into that in a lot more detail.
Mm-hmm. Do you use biblical scholarship in your philosophy papers or not much?
It depends. I like to do it, but what I've noticed is, especially when it comes to the doctrine of God, your average systematic theologian doesn't care. Like they just don't. So when I run these arguments, like John Peckham, like he'll do this all day long in all of his books. He'll just be like, yeah, this is what all the biblical scholarship is saying. Says God is like X, Y, and Z. You know, he's got empathy, he's got this or that. And then a lot of systematic theologians go, but the tradition said, and you're like, well, that sure, but like, what's the more authoritative thing?
Yeah.
And then we always like claim it's the Bible, but it's not. We don't care about the Bible. We see it in practice all the time. So Keith Ward, he pointed this out in a book in 2015. I think it was called Christ and Cosmos. He says, when you're looking at debates over the doctrine of God, you're not looking at biblical scholarship most of the time. You're looking at competing metaphysical accounts. He's like, people just aren't interested. They say they are, but they're not. And I'm like, yeah, I can see it. I see it in practice a lot.
Okay, that's actually interesting.
Yeah. So like, so I've got this forthcoming debate book on simplicity, and I've got a whole biblical argument that I lay out saying like, this is why simplicity contradicts the Bible. I know what the response is going to be. I know it's like, well, there's lots of things the Bible could mean. And I'm like, yeah. So it only describes God as one way. It never describes him any other way. But sure, there's lots of things that could, sure. Yeah.
Right, like there are different interpretations of the Bible, sure, but some of them are way better than others.
That's part of the story. Yeah. So you've got these competing arguments you can give for different interpretations. But when it comes to the case of, say, like God being passible, having passive potency, that is the only thing. It doesn't ever give you anything else other than that. Same thing with God being temporal. All the words used to describe eternity are temporal terms. Like there's no inconsistency. There's nothing that's up for debate about that. And so to claim, oh, well, when God says over and over and over again that he has empathy, what he really means is he has no empathy at all. Then you can just, what I say in response is, okay, so God lacks basic communication skills. Great. Like, I just don't understand what we're doing anymore.
Exactly. Because the Bible is inspired by the Holy Spirit, right? So why would he communicate false things about himself? What would be the point of this?
The claim you get is that the Holy Spirit has to tell you these things because you're too stupid to understand them. Because of the weakness of our minds, God has to present himself to you as not what he is, but as you see him. That's what Calvin says. And what I've done in some papers is kind of point out, okay, let's really go with this. So when we look at most of the major theologians for, like, say, the first 1,000 years of the church, they were able to figure out that God's impassible. So why did God really feel the need to like reveal himself as the exact opposite of that? Were we really too weak to understand it? You know, the Council of Nicaea, that was like, like over 300 politicians got together, and they were able to figure out that God was impassible. But Moses and Elijah and Isaiah and Jeremiah, they were too stupid to figure this out. I see. This is what's going on. And so all I'm doing is just trying to draw out, this is what the implications of the claim are. Do you really want to make that claim?
Oh, that's interesting. Is the Council of Nicaea affirming impassibility?
No, I sorry, not Nicaea. It was Chalcedon. It's in the Anathemas of Chalcedon.
Oh, so it's actually affirmed in the Council.
Yeah. One of the anathemas of Chalcedon is if you say God suffers in his divine nature, anathema.
Wow. Okay, so that's actually an argument against the councils, then, based
Mhm.
on biblical authority and a proper interpretation of scripture. That's okay. There seems to be passability, not
Yeah.
impassability, but the councils affirming impassability, or this particular council, therefore, well, they don't really have authority because they're false, or they have something
Yeah.
false, or yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's actually interesting. Because I mean, I'm a Protestant. I don't really care about the councils. To be honest.
So like, to some extent, yeah. I mean, this is the thing:
Yeah.
is your average theologian doesn't really know the content of most of the councils. They just know something like God's three persons, one essence, and Jesus is one person with two natures. And beyond that, most of the details they don't know. So even when I meet like a lot of people saying I affirm all the councils, I'm like, a lot of the documents surrounding some of these councils haven't even been translated in English. Like I remember
Right,
talking
right.
to Donald Fairbairn. Donald Fairbairn is this really great patristic scholar, and I was asking him about the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and he was like, "Yeah, we only probably have translated into English maybe about 15% of all the relevant documents around like a council like that, and a lot of the other councils." And I was like, "That's it?" And he's like, "Yeah, it's an area we just need to do a lot more study on." I'm like, wow, I really feel out of my depths now because that's not my area of expertise, you know?
Right,
Um,
right, right.
yeah. And so like it's a topic that needs to be studied more, which is good, but it also should give us a little bit more pause about how confident we want to be that we understand the councils and the sort of authority we want to give them in our theology.
Right, I guess for like Catholics and Orthodox, they're kind of forced to accept a lot of them, I think.
Mhm.
So that's I'm not sure what they can do with the possibility thing, right? Uh, but yeah, my view is that I don't really see the councils necessarily as inspired, to be honest. I think the Bible is inspired. I think a lot of the stuff from the councils is correct, so not everything is nonsense. But if they're not inspired, then whatever. It's just a few theologians and clergymen getting together.
Trying to figure stuff out, which is what we're
Yeah,
doing today. And so
exactly.
which is what I take I think the right way to look at the councils is to go, they're people who developed some arguments. They also had some really gross political backstabbing going on. So you got to cut through that. But when you get to the arguments, now we can assess the arguments. Some of the arguments, I think they're great. Some of them, not so much. Some of them, I think I can make the arguments better. So
Mhm.
like, I don't think they did a great job at getting rid of Arianism. Okay, I think I can do better, you know, or we need to do better, you know. So
Right. Yeah.
it's just the rational process of trying to do theology.
Right. And to be clear for the audience, I'm against heresies, right? So I'm not claiming that, oh yeah, get rid of the councils, whatever. We should be
Right.
open to heresy and stuff like. No, I'm against heresy, but that's because of scripture. So if
Mhm.
somebody affirms Arianism, I think it's false. Why? Well, because of what the Bible implies.
Mhm. Yeah, and
Right?
you've got some arguments to run just like the people at the councils did. So you're doing the
Exactly.
exact same thing that they were doing, which is trying to offer
Exactly.
biblical and philosophical arguments.
Exactly. Um. Now, I guess, Justin, you don't like this stuff too much, right?
Yeah, no, but like, how is it?
You view them as inspired, right? Like inspired
Yeah,
tradition or something.
yeah. At the moment, I'm like half asleep, so I'm like not thinking well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So yeah. No, no,
Okay.
I'll come with like a comeback in the shower and be like,
And then it'd be like, this is what I should have asked Ryan.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I'm gonna put like post like 5 paragraphs in the comments
Yeah.
of a video I'm in. It's like,
Yeah.
oh,
Here's a response video to my own video. And
yeah,
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 that's what you
yeah.
should. Yeah. Yeah.
I think William Lane Craig disagrees with some part, even from the Council of Nicaea,
Mhm.
that has to do with the only begotten Son, I think.
Mhm.
Do you know much about this stuff? What's
Yeah.
your
Yeah, I can explain this and then I
okay?
need to run.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this will be a good topic to end on. So when you're looking at Nicaea, the claim is that the Father causes the Son to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very explicitly cause. It's an efficient
Mm-hmm.
cause. When you look throughout later history, some other people want to start adding in other Aristotelian causes into the story as well, but efficient causation is what's going on. Um, the council distinguishes between because it's a generation, eternal generation, and the word is genitos.
Mhm.
Now they also say that the Son is begotten, not made. Made is also genitos, but it's spelled with one less letter. And what they're trying to do is trying to draw out two different kinds of implications of efficient causation that you see in a lot of debates in Western history. So what the claim of eternal generation is that the Son is eternally caused to eternally exist. So eternal causes can have eternal effects. Whereas something is made, genitas, it's made, it means it begins to exist. So it hasn't always existed. So the Son is caused to exist in a way that he eternally exists. He's not caused to exist in a way where he begins to exist. That's what the distinction is supposed to do. Craig thinks that, first off, there's nothing in Scripture that's going to get you to this. And most biblical scholars go, yeah, like that's just not what's going on there, unless they want to do a spiritual interpretation of the text. Otherwise, it's just like, this is not there. So Craig's like, that's right. And then Craig also wants to say, to be God is to not have a cause for your existence. So if the Son has a cause for his existence, the Son's not God. So that's pretty bad, since I want to say that the Trinity is true. So let's get rid of that. So this is kind of Craig's move, is to say, I really want to affirm the Trinity. And so if I have the Son being caused to exist, then I don't have a Trinity. So we got to get rid of. So for the sake of the Trinity, we have to get rid of this one claim. And so what he'll say is, well, we can take this claim of generation to mean what you see in the Bible, which is he is unique, one of a kind, sent to do this unique, one of a kind thing. So it's a statement about the incarnation, not a statement about the eternal life of God.
So it's not about Jesus, like the second person, being caused or being grounded on the Father.
No.
And I guess that's where they base the monarchical Trinitarian view, right? That in this kind of reading. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks a lot for being here. I really like this episode, starting from explaining the writing process, which I think it's very helpful, both for students, but also for those who want to get into academia, want to start publishing papers, and also the discussion that we had. Did you like the discussion? Or?
Yeah, I thought it was good.
Okay. Okay, that's good.
I don't want to trash the video at the end of the video. I mean,
Why not?
it's terrible. It's the worst conversation I've ever had.
Nonsense, you know. Okay, so thanks for being here. Now, Justin, you have anything to say?
No, I don't have anything to say at the moment.
At the moment,
You
when
will
you
see,
come back, that's
yeah.
fine.
I'll take a shower. You're gonna see my 5-page response in the comments.
Good.
Okay.
I'm gonna dedicate my entire career based off this episode alone.
So that was the first episode of the second season. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, right? And see you.